35 years ago, a young girl's body was found in a rain-soaked cornfield in upstate New York. No name, no ID, and no one coming to claim her. For decades, she was known only as Caledonia Jane Doe, a ghost haunting the edges of America's cold case files. But what no one could have imagined was that this mystery would one day be solved, not by police, but by a determined sister, an online sleuth, and the power of modern DNA. Her story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and justice, long delayed. And tonight, we're retracing the extraordinary journey of how a runaway from Florida vanished without a trace, and how strangers across the internet gave her name back. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss another true story like this. For more than 30 years, a nameless girl wandered the memory of upstate New York. She was known only by the place she was discovered, a quiet farming hamlet that would forever be linked to her story. This is the tale of how a chance discovery in 1979 would ignite one of America's most haunting mysteries, and how a new generation of investigators and online sleuths refused to let her fade into obscurity. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, murder. These are dark territories we willingly explore because the truth often lies in the shadows. And today, we're diving into a chilling cold case where internet detectives waded into the unknown and made astonishing breakthroughs. So buckle in. We're hitting the gas, swerving through intrigue, and crashing headfirst into a 30-year enigma. On a crisp autumn morning in 1979, a sleepy farming community in New York State awoke to horror. In a rain-soaked cornfield just off US Route 20, near the village of Caledonia, a local farmer doing his routine check stumbled upon what, at first glance, looked like a trespasser in a red jacket. But as he drew closer, dread overtook his curiosity. There, face down among the stalks, lay the body of a young woman. No identification, no name, only tragedy. When the Livingston County Sheriff's Office arrived, on what was later recorded as November 10th, they found a girl who was clearly young, though her exact age was unknown. She had been shot twice, one bullet to the right eye, another to her upper back. The grim evidence painted a cold, cruel picture. Ballistics would later confirm the cruel instrument was a .38 caliber slug found beneath her body. Investigators inferred a vicious sequence. She was first shot by the roadside, then dragged about 20 feet into the cornfield, and struck again from behind. Her pockets were turned inside out. Someone had rifled through them, erasing even the trace of who she was. Sheriff's deputies combed the muddy field and roadside, but the heavy overnight rainfall had erased vital clues. Footprints, tire, tracks, DNA evidence, all likely washed away under torrents of rain. Still, the investigation unearthed a few haunting details. There was no wallet, no papers, no identifying documents, only silence and mystery. The inversion of her pocket suggested someone was determined she remain nameless. The motive remained unclear: robbery, personal vendetta, or something more twisted. The medical examiner confirmed that the shot to her eye was fired at extremely close range. She had neither flinched nor turned. She had been taken completely by surprise. The second shot struck her back after she was already down. In that lonely cornfield, the silence bore witness to a cruel act. Among the only items recovered were two metal keychains affixed to her belt loops, a cheap, heartbreaking detail. One was a little heart-shaped locket inscribed, "He who holds the key can open my heart." The other was the matching key. Investigators traced the trinkets to vending machines along the New York State Thruway, a clue that she, and perhaps her killer had traveled that route not long before her death. The rest was darkness. The rest was waiting. It was a small clue, fragile, almost forgettable, but to investigators it whispered possibilities. Maybe the girl and her companion had been traveling across New York, just two faces on the highway, before fate brought them to their tragic stop in Caledonia. Around her neck, the victim wore a delicate silver necklace strung with three small turquoise stones. The craftsmanship was distinctly Southwestern, handmade, rustic, and unmistakably Native American in style. In the rural farmlands of upstate New York, such jewelry stood out like a desert flower in a snowstorm, hinting that she might have come from somewhere much farther south, perhaps New Mexico, Arizona, or Texas. Combined with the keychains, the necklace told a quiet story of movement, of a journey that began in sunlight and ended in rain. As forensic teams gathered every scrap of evidence, detectives canvassed diners, truck stops, and gas stations across nearby towns. The coroner's report added another piece to the puzzle. The girl had eaten shortly before she died. Her stomach contained potatoes, sweet corn, and ham, a hearty, diner-style meal. That detail led investigators to a crucial witness. A waitress in the small town of Lima, just a few miles from Caledonia, recalled serving a young girl around 11:30 that night. She wasn't alone. With her sat an older man who paid for both meals. To the waitress, they seemed ordinary, just another late-night pair sharing a quiet dinner. But hours later, that girl would be found dead in a cornfield. From that single recollection, police built their first suspect profile. The man was described as white, roughly 5'8" to 5'9", with curly hair, dark wire-rimmed glasses, and driving a tan station wagon. Authorities circulated a composite sketch and an alert for any matching vehicle. Whoever he was, he had shared a meal with her, and then, less than an hour later, she was gone. "Why would you buy someone dinner?" waitress Marge Bradford later said, "and then kill them 45 minutes later and dump them in a field?" It was the question that haunted every investigator who touched the case. Meanwhile, the girl herself remained a Jane Doe. The autopsy offered a physical portrait. Between 13 and 19 years old, petite at 5'3" and about 120 pounds, with a sun-kissed athletic build that didn't fit a November in New York. Deep tan lines in the shape of a halter top suggested she'd spent time recently in a warm climate. Tanning beds were rare in the late 70s, and upstate New York certainly wasn't sunny enough for that kind of color. The evidence pointed to someone who'd lived, at least for a while, under brighter skies. Her hair was light brown, wavy, shoulder length, with faded highlights grown out about 4 months. Her eyes were a gentle brown, her skin lightly freckled, with traces of acne across her face and chest, signs of youth. There were no scars, tattoos, or healed fractures, nothing that could tie her to hospital records. But one detail spoke volumes: her teeth. They were in poor condition, riddled with untreated cavities. One molar had decayed so severely that only the roots remained. Forensic dentists noted a few signs of crude dental work, done in a way that didn't match standard U.S. practices, perhaps work done outside the country or by someone without proper training. She had no fillings, no braces, no signs of the orthodontic care typical of American teenagers, suggesting a life of hardship, neglect, or transience. None of her wisdom teeth had erupted yet, confirming she was likely under 18. Her blood type was A negative. And yet, despite all these fragments, no missing persons report anywhere in the country seemed to fit her description. She was a young woman out of place, her origins written in turquoise and sunlight, her fate sealed in rain and silence. Though the case remained without a living match, every small clue was carefully preserved, filed away in hopes that someday, someone would recognize her. Her clothing, ordinary yet revealing, offered investigators their next glimpse into who she might have been. When she was found, she was fully dressed in clothes that could have come straight off any late 70s teenager: tan corduroy pants, women's size 7, a multicolored plaid button-up shirt, and over it, a red windbreaker with black stripes down the sleeves. The tag inside read, Auto Sports Products Inc., a men's jacket that looked like something given away at a car event or racetrack. Detectives traced it to a small promotional run, hundreds made, none serialized, impossible to trace to one person. On her feet were brown shoes with ripple soles, blue knee-high socks, a white bra, and blue underwear. Every piece seemed bought off the rack. Nothing custom, nothing that screamed wealth or privilege. Just a girl dressed for travel, for comfort, for the road. Each item was logged, photographed, and examined under harsh fluorescent light. And when the time came, police released a retouched post-mortem photo and a sketch to the press. Her face, still recognizable despite the close-range gunshot, looked young and familiar enough to stir the hearts of those who saw it. But no one called. No parents, no friends, no missing person report that fit. Across New York State and the surrounding regions, detectives scoured lists of runaway teens and missing girls. Nothing matched. The FBI ran her fingerprints through its national system, but no records came back. She had never been fingerprinted, had no official identity in any federal or state database. To the world, she was no one. So investigators were left with fragments of a life that didn't quite fit together. A young woman with tan lines from a warmer world, found dead in a freezing New York field. Clothes suggesting travel, trinkets from roadside vending machines, and a humble meal shared with a stranger who might have been her last company on Earth. The townspeople whispered theories. A runaway? A hitchhiker? A victim of a passing killer? The questions hung heavy in the air. Who was Jane Doe? Why was she in Caledonia? And who ended her life so brutally? While media attention eventually waned, local detectives refused to let her disappear completely. They held onto her file, reopened it when technology advanced, and year after year revisited those haunting photos. Each clue, the red jacket, the turquoise necklace, the heart-shaped keychain, became relics of a mystery that demanded answers. For decades, the nameless girl of Caledonia waited for someone to call her by her real name, to be seen not as evidence, but as a person who had once lived, laughed, and loved before her journey ended in a cold New York cornfield. When the cameras stopped rolling and the sponsor message faded, the story returned to the cold winds of Caledonia. From the very beginning, the case of the nameless girl weighed heavily on everyone involved. But for one man, it became a lifelong calling. John York, a young Livingston County deputy sheriff who had been among the first to reach the scene that November morning. The sight of the young woman lying lifeless in that rain-soaked cornfield would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the years passed, York climbed the ranks, eventually being elected sheriff in the 1980s, a position he would hold until 2013. Yet no matter how many other crimes he investigated, one case never left his mind. The girl, known only as Callie Doe because of where she had been found, became both his responsibility and his promise. York refused to let her vanish into the archives. He visited her grave often, quietly speaking to her as though she might somehow hear. In his private reflections, he'd whisper, "What did we miss? What did we overlook?" And with quiet resolve, he'd add, "You don't think that kid deserves justice?" To York, Callie wasn't just a case file. She was a child stripped of her name, abandoned twice, and it was his duty to make sure she would be forgotten no more. During the early years, York and his fellow investigators did everything humanly possible to give her back her identity. Without digital databases or DNA testing, every lead meant days of legwork, checking missing persons reports by hand, phoning departments across the country, even reaching out to agencies in Canada and overseas. They produced flyers describing her face, clothes, and jewelry, mailing them to police stations and news outlets nationwide. York's law enforcement students helped stuff envelopes and write addresses, learning not just procedure, but empathy, perseverance, and what it meant to seek justice for someone without a voice. Over the next several years, more than 10,000 tips poured in. Each one was logged, chased, and compared, a staggering number that reflected not only the public's curiosity, but also the desperation of the investigation. They compared notes with missing person bulletins, called hospitals, checked schools, and even consulted runaway shelters. But the late 1970s and early 80s were a different time. No centralized databases, no shared digital networks, no quick searches. Finding one girl out of millions was like looking for a ghost in the dark. As it became clear that neither the girl nor her killer might have been local, investigators expanded their search to the highways. Caledonia sits near major routes connecting to the New York State Thruway, a corridor heavily traveled by truckers and cross-country drivers. Detectives scoured truck stops, gas stations, and roadside diners, showing the composite sketch of the curly-haired man in glasses and the girl's picture. A few long-haul drivers thought they'd seen a teenager matching her description hitchhiking along Route 20 around the time of the murder. It wasn't proof, just fragments, but it suggested a heartbreaking possibility. Maybe she was a runaway, a wanderer trusting the wrong person on a cold November night. By the end of 1980, every lead had dried up. The girl still had no name, no family to claim her, and no answers to explain her death. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere and vanished again, leaving only grief in her wake. With heavy hearts, the Livingston County authorities made the decision they had hoped never to face: to lay her to rest without a name. In 1980, she was buried at Greenmount Cemetery under a simple gray headstone engraved with the words, "Lest we forget, unidentified girl, November 1979, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." To Sheriff York, those words weren't just an epitaph. They were a promise, one he intended to keep, no matter how many years it would take. The inscription carved into the cold granite of her grave carried a promise as timeless as grief itself. Though her name was unknown, the people of Caledonia vowed she would never be forgotten. Only a small handful of mourners gathered for her funeral: local officers, townsfolk, and strangers who'd felt an inexplicable pull to stand witness for the girl no one claimed. Among them was John York. For him, this wasn't just another case closed, it was a personal covenant. Caledonia had adopted her in death, and as long as he drew breath, she would have a voice. Through the 1980s and 1990s, York and his team refused to let the case fade into the archives. They chased every lead, every rumor, every description of a missing teenage girl that remotely fit her build or timeline. Dental records were compared by hand, photographs mailed across the country, and every law enforcement agency that would listen, from California to Maine, even Canada and Interpol, was contacted. The case file grew to fill entire cabinets, bursting with reports and letters. Still, every potential match dissolved into nothing. It was as if the girl had never officially existed, never been reported missing, never had a home waiting for her return. That chilling possibility haunted the investigators. Maybe she came from a life where no one noticed her absence, or worse, from a home where she'd never been wanted at all. Even so, the search for her identity reached the national spotlight. America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the Caledonia Jane Doe, hoping to reach someone who might recognize her. The phones lit up with tips, from viewers, from psychics, from armchair detectives, but none led to her name. The years passed, and the cost mounted. By the early 2000s, the Caledonia Jane Doe case had become the most exhaustive and expensive investigation in Livingston County's history. Yet Sheriff York refused to close it. He made sure the evidence, the red jacket, the necklace, the bullets, was preserved like sacred relics, waiting for the day when science might finally catch up to justice. What haunted York most wasn't just the brutality of her death, but the unbearable thought that somewhere, someone had once loved this girl, a mother, a sister, a friend. How could it be that in all these years no one came forward? Theories swirled. Maybe she'd run away long before her death, and her family assumed she'd started a new life. Maybe she'd been lost in the foster system, slipping through bureaucratic cracks. Or perhaps she wasn't even American, an immigrant teen, unseen and uncounted. Investigators explored them all, keeping her dental records and later her DNA profile on file, ready for comparison as national databases slowly evolved. And still, decade after decade, she remained what she had been since that cold November morning, the girl without a name. But thanks to John York and a handful of determined souls, she was never the girl without a story. As the years slipped by with no suspect in sight, investigators began to wonder if Caledonia's Jane Doe might have crossed paths with one of the many predators roaming America's highways during that violent era. The late 70s and early 80s were the golden age of interstate serial killers, men who moved unseen from state to state, hunting the vulnerable and forgotten. The idea that the girl in the cornfield could have been one of their countless victims seemed horrifyingly plausible. In 1984, the case took a dramatic turn when the infamous Henry Lee Lucas, a drifter whose name had become synonymous with deceit and murder, confessed to killing an unidentified girl in upstate New York. His story bore uncanny similarities to the Caledonia case: a young woman, a cornfield, a gun. At the time, Lucas was already in custody in Texas, spinning out confession after confession, claiming responsibility for hundreds of murders across the country. Some were real, most were fiction. Law enforcement agencies, desperate for closure in unsolved cases, took him seriously, at least at first. Lucas even dragged his companion, Otis Toole, into the tale, claiming the two had picked up a hitchhiker near Philadelphia and later shot her in a New York field. On paper, it almost fit. Both men were known to drift through the region in 1979. But when investigators pressed Lucas for details only the killer could know, his story began to crumble. The times, locations, and facts didn't match. No physical evidence linked the men to the crime. Lucas was, in truth, a pathological liar, a man who craved attention and manipulated law enforcement for favors and fame. Eventually, the Texas Rangers rescinded more than 200 of his so-called solved cases when it became clear he'd been fed information from files and fabricated entire stories. Caledonia's Jane Doe was among those false confessions. By the mid-1980s, investigators officially ruled Lucas's claims not credible. The brief spark of hope vanished, replaced once again by frustration and silence. But the investigation didn't stop there. Another potential suspect soon drew attention: Christopher Wilder, a wealthy, charismatic man who, by 1984, had embarked on a brutal multi-state spree of abductions and murders targeting young women. Wilder had connections to both Florida and New York, and a documented passion for car racing, a chilling coincidence given the victim's red racing-style jacket. Sheriff York couldn't ignore the parallel. In fact, records later confirmed that Wilder had been hiding in upstate New York in mid-1979, the same period when Caledonia Doe was killed. The idea that he might have charmed and lured her, just as he did many of his later victims, fit his well-known pattern. Still, there was no concrete link, no DNA, no witness, no confession. When Wilder was killed in a police shootout in 1984, any chance to question him about the girl in the cornfield died with him. His potential connection remained only speculation, a tantalizing, unproven lead. By the end of that decade, the case file contained the names of more than 60 known killers and violent offenders who had operated during that time. Each new arrest, each new headline, sent Livingston County detectives back to their notes, checking timelines, habits, and methods against the murder of one unknown girl in a New York cornfield. Every possibility was explored, every thread pursued. Yet after years of effort, the truth about who killed her and why remained buried in the same cold earth where she was found. By the early 2000s, nearly 25 years had passed since the girl's body was found in that cold New York cornfield. The case remained unsolved, her name still unknown, yet the file never gathered dust. Generations of investigators felt an unspoken duty to her memory. Then, in 2005, a new light appeared on the horizon: science. For the first time, forensic technology had advanced far beyond the limits of the 1970s, and Sheriff John York's team seized the chance to give Caledonia Doe one more shot at being found. With a court order secured, the young woman's remains were carefully exhumed from her resting place in Greenmount Cemetery. 26 years had passed since her burial, and though the earth had claimed much, science had evolved into something almost miraculous. Bone and tooth samples were extracted and sent to a state forensic lab, where specialists worked to recover even the smallest trace of her DNA. It was a painstaking process, but it worked. Against all odds, a viable genetic profile was produced. It didn't solve the case overnight, but it lit a beacon in the darkness. For the first time, if one of her relatives ever submitted their DNA to a database, a match could be made. At the same time, investigators pursued newer methods still in their infancy, like forensic palynology, the study of pollen grains. In 2006, the victim's clothing, preserved for decades, was sent to Texas A&M University for analysis. Under a microscope, the fabric revealed a hidden story: tiny particles of oak, spruce, birch, and Australian pine. Each one a signature of the places she'd been. Oak was common enough, but spruce and birch were not native to western New York's farmland. More surprising was the discovery of Australian pine pollen, an invasive tree that only grows in select regions of the United States: South Florida, southern Texas, and parts of coastal California such as San Diego and the Central Coast. It cannot survive New York's harsh winters, which meant the girl must have been in one of those warmer places not long before her death. The results painted a haunting travel narrative. She might have started in Southern California, perhaps near San Diego, traveling east through mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevada, where she picked up traces of spruce and birch. Or maybe she had come from Florida, where Australian pine grows thick along the coastline. Her deep tan lines only reinforced what the science now confirmed: she wasn't from New York. She had come from the sun. Further analysis using isotope testing a chemical fingerprinting technique that measures oxygen and mineral signatures in teeth and bones, added more depth to her story. The isotopes revealed she had likely spent her childhood in the southern or southwestern United States, places like Texas, Arizona, or California. Her bone composition suggested long-term exposure to warm climates and specific water sources tied to those regions. Together, the pollen and isotopic data formed a stunning consensus. Science was confirming what instinct and observation had hinted at for decades: that the girl buried under the name Caledonia Jane Doe had not been local at all. She had lived her life under different skies, in the warmth of the South or the glow of the West, before a dark turn of fate brought her to that lonely field in upstate New York. And now, for the first time, investigators could trace not just how she died, but where she had truly lived. The forensic breakthroughs of 2005 and 2006 were just the beginning. Determined to give Caledonia's Jane Doe a face, investigators turned to art and compassion. In 2010, forensic artist Carl Koppelman, a volunteer who had already built a quiet reputation for bringing the unidentified back to life through portraiture, offered his time and talent to the case. Using morgue photographs, autopsy data, and early facial reconstruction measurements, Koppelman created a soft, lifelike rendering of the girl as she might have looked in life. A pretty teenager with feathered light brown hair, gentle features, and a faint, almost knowing smile. He even depicted her wearing the same red windbreaker and turquoise necklace she was found in, hoping the familiar details might trigger someone's memory. When Koppelman's portrait went live on NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, it marked a turning point. For the first time, Callie Doe's likeness, DNA profile, dental charts, and case summary were all in a public database accessible to anyone: detectives, journalists, or ordinary citizens scrolling late at night. She was no longer confined to a dusty file in the Livingston County archives. Her image could finally travel the world. By 2010, investigators had gathered more data than ever before. She was almost certainly from the southern or southwestern United States, had likely traveled long distances before her death, and her DNA was now preserved in national systems awaiting a match. And yet, despite science, sketches, and countless hours of work, she remained a mystery. A girl whose story was written in her bones, but whose name had been erased. But what the sheriff's department couldn't foresee was that the next chapter in the investigation wouldn't be driven solely by law enforcement. It would come from the rise of a new kind of detective. As the internet began to reshape communication in the early 2000s, online communities of true crime enthusiasts emerged, connecting strangers who shared one obsession: solving the unsolved. Websites like Sleuths, the Doe Network, and later Reddit's r// Unresolved Mysteries became digital meeting grounds where amateur investigators traded theories, compared evidence, and revived long-forgotten cases. Among them, the Caledonia Jane Doe case quickly became one of the most talked-about mysteries on the web. A dedicated thread on Sleuths grew to over 100 pages. A living archive of speculation, research, and compassion. Members dissected every detail: the red jacket, the diner sighting, the keychains, the turquoise necklace, even the forensic pollen results. And right there in those discussions was Carl Koppelman himself, the same artist who had drawn her portrait. By day, he worked as an accountant. By night, he pored over databases of missing persons, meticulously comparing faces and timelines. His online volunteer work made him one of the most respected figures in the digital true crime world. The Web Sleuths era was remarkable not just for its enthusiasm, but for how it bridged two worlds: official investigators, and ordinary citizens. For the first time, detectives began quietly monitoring these forums, sometimes even engaging directly with the digital sleuths when credible leads emerged. The Doe network, where Caledonia Jane Doe was filed as Case 1, served as a structured database that complemented NamUs and law enforcement records, creating a synergy between forensic data and crowdsourced insight. And it worked. Years of persistence, from professionals and civilians alike, laid the groundwork for the miracle that was to come. The long cold case was about to be cracked open, not by chance, but by an extraordinary alliance. A grieving friend who never stopped searching, a volunteer with a gift for faces, and detectives willing to listen. Their combined efforts would finally bring light to the name behind the face and give justice to the girl who had waited in silence for more than 3 decades. As theories swirled across online forums, the central question that haunted investigators and web sleuths alike remained unanswered. Who killed her, and why? Some believed her killer was a stranger, perhaps a truck driver, a transient predator, or even a serial killer passing through. Others suspected she'd known her murderer, maybe a boyfriend or a travel companion. The fact that she'd been seen calmly sharing dinner with a man shortly before her death hinted at a level of trust, at least initially. But skeptics countered that hitchhikers often accepted food from kind strangers. A moment of warmth could easily have turned deadly. The lack of defensive wounds only deepened the mystery, suggesting either shock, trust, or surrender. Within the growing online community, the most astute sleuths began identifying a troubling pattern. Maybe Jane Doe hadn't been identified simply because she'd never been officially reported missing. Families sometimes failed to report a runaway, assuming she'd left by choice, while older paper-based reports were easily lost or never digitized. This theory, that she existed in a void rather than in any database, would prove chillingly accurate. Searching for someone who wasn't listed anywhere was like chasing a shadow. But the dedication of the online sleuths ensured that Callie Doe's name stayed alive, her photo resurfacing in countless discussions, her story traveling farther than ever before. And then, quietly, the breakthrough came, not from a lab, but from memory. In the early 2010s, in Hernando County, Florida, a woman named Laurel Nowell began thinking about her old high school friend, Tammy Jo Alexander. Tammy had been a lively, adventurous girl, warm, independent, the kind of friend who made ordinary days feel electric. But by the late 1970s, she had simply vanished. Laurel searched for her online, scrolling through Facebook, people finder sites, anything that might show a trace of her. But there was nothing. No digital footprint, no sign that Tammy Jo had ever grown up, married, or even existed beyond her teenage years. Uneasy, Laurel reached out to Tammy's half-sister, Pamela Dyson, still living in Florida. What she learned shocked her. No one in Tammy's family had heard from her since the late 1970s. Her mother, Barbara, had once told police that Tammy was missing, but local officers in Hernando County hadn't taken it seriously. Tammy had a reputation for hitchhiking and disappearing for short stretches. They assumed she'd run off again. Worse still, when Pamela and Laurel requested records in 2014, they found that no missing person report for Tammy Jo Alexander existed at all. Whether it had been misplaced, misfiled, or never logged, the effect was the same. Officially, she had never been missing. Realizing this devastating oversight, the Hernando County Sheriff's Office filed a new missing person report in August 2014, 35 years after Tammy disappeared. For the first time, her name entered the national systems, NamUs and NCIC, as an officially missing teenager. Her entry included a faded yearbook photo, a bright-eyed girl with feathered light brown hair, and a smile full of promise. It was a bureaucratic correction decades too late, but one that would finally change everything. Not long after Tammy's case was added to Namos, fate and technology intervened. Carl Koppelman, the volunteer artist who had drawn Caledonia's Jane Doe years earlier, was browsing new listings, as he often did. He'd spent thousands of hours reconstructing faces, memorizing the lines and shapes of those long forgotten. And when he saw Tammy's photo in September 2014, he froze. The resemblance was undeniable. The same cheekbones, the same soft smile, the same wavy, sun-streaked hair. The moment I saw her photo, Koppelman later said, it clicked. That was Caledonia Jane Doe. Every late night spent sketching, every discussion on the forums, every theory exchanged among strangers across the internet had led to that one instant of recognition. Koppelman didn't hesitate. He reached out immediately to law enforcement, certain that after 35 years he had finally found the girl in the red jacket. And her name was Tammy Jo Alexander. On September 20th, 2014, everything changed. That morning, Carl Koppelman sat at his computer and sent an email that would bridge 35 years of silence. In it, he laid out a simple but stunning theory that a newly listed missing teenager from Florida, Tammy Jo Alexander, was, in fact, the long unidentified Caledonia Jane Doe. He included photographs, side-by-side comparisons, and a breakdown of the uncanny similarities. Tammy's age at the time of her disappearance, 16, perfectly matched the medical examiner's estimate. Her timeline fit, too. Last seen in the spring of 1979, the same year and season that the unidentified girl appeared in a New York cornfield that November. Her Florida roots matched the tan lines, the pollen evidence, and even the jewelry style found on the victim. And most striking of all, the high school yearbook photo of Tammy Jo looked like a younger mirror image of the face Carl had reconstructed years earlier. He copied both the Livingston County Sheriff's Office and Hernando County authorities, effectively connecting all the right people in one stroke. It was a bold move. A volunteer web sleuth telling law enforcement he might have solved one of the nation's longest-standing Jane Doe mysteries. But to their credit, the investigators didn't dismiss him. The logic was airtight, and after decades of dead ends, hope felt like oxygen. Sheriff Thomas Doherty's team contacted Pamela Dyson, Tammy's half-sister, and requested a DNA sample to test against the preserved remains. By late 2014, a mitochondrial DNA test was underway, a method tracing maternal lineage that could confirm or exclude family connection even from decades-old remains. At the same time, investigators began piecing together Tammy's final days. Family members confirmed she had left home in 1979 and never returned. An ex-boyfriend recalled seeing her that spring, carefree, hitchhiking, talking about traveling north. Everything fit. Every fragment of her story aligned perfectly with the mystery that had haunted Caledonia for 35 years. And then, in January 2015, the call came. The DNA was a match. The girl in the red jacket was Tammy Jo Alexander. After 3.5 decades, the nameless teenager from the cornfield finally had her name back. The news was kept quiet for a few days, giving investigators time to reach the family. Then, on January 26, 2015, former Sheriff John York, the same deputy who had stood over the body in 1979, stood before the cameras and announced the truth to the world. The room filled with emotion as he said, voice trembling, "To be able to put a name on her. I can't even tell you what it means." We've always said the first step in solving this case is knowing who the victim is. At last, they knew her. Tammy Jo Alexander, 16 years old from Florida, a runaway whose story had been trapped in limbo for nearly 4 decades. For her family, the revelation was bittersweet. Pamela Dyson and Laurel Nowell, the sister and best friend who had never stopped wondering, were devastated by the truth, but grateful for the closure. Pamela later said softly, "I'm glad to know what happened, but it hurts to know she died that way. Nobody should be shot and dragged into the woods." In June 2015, Livingston County held a ceremony at Greenmount Cemetery to replace the old gravestone that had read "Unidentified Girl, November 1979." A local funeral home donated a new headstone engraved with Tammy's full name and her brief lifespan, 1963–1979. Around 100 people gathered that day: family, friends, townsfolk, and the investigators who had kept her memory alive. Carl Koppelman flew from California to attend, standing quietly among them, the man whose compassion and persistence had finally brought Tammy home. The ceremony was both heartbreaking and triumphant. After 35 years, the girl who had once been known only as Caledonia Jane Doe was now recognized, mourned, and loved as Tammy Jo Alexander. Flowers covered her grave, and prayers filled the air. For Sheriff York, Sheriff Dougherty, and the many who had refused to forget her, it was the end of one mystery and the beginning of her legacy. Tammy's sister, Pamela, soon became an advocate for missing persons, urging families to use NamUs and public databases so that no other loved one would vanish without record. Her message was clear and powerful. If Laurel and Pamela hadn't discovered that Tammy's disappearance had never been officially filed, she might still be a Jane Doe today. For the first time in 35 years, justice had a name, and Caledonia's Jane Doe could finally rest in peace. Their persistence, paired with Carl's sharp eyes and the connective power of the internet, had finally broken the mystery wide open. The revelation of Tammy Jo Alexander's identity didn't just close one of America's oldest Jane Doe cases. It sent shockwaves through the world of law enforcement. The FBI and local agencies across the country pointed to the case as a shining example of what can happen when professional investigators and online citizens join forces instead of working in isolation. At St. John Fisher College, media scholar Thomas Parisi reflected on the breakthrough, saying, "Without the internet and social media, this case might never have been solved. Each year, cold cases grow colder, like two icebergs drifting apart. What the internet did was bring them back together." It was a poetic truth. In this case, the missing person record of a Florida teenager and the long-forgotten Jane Doe of Caledonia converge because ordinary people, armed with technology and compassion, refused to stop looking. But even as one mystery was solved, the identity of the girl in the red jacket, another loomed larger than ever. Who killed Tammy Jo Alexander? With her name restored, investigators shifted focus from "who is she" to "who did this to her?" Sheriff Thomas Dougherty and his team reopened the homicide with renewed energy, tracing Tammy's final movements to understand how a vibrant 16-year-old from Florida ended up dead in a New York cornfield. That search led back to Tammy's story, a life filled with turbulence, courage, and longing for escape. Born November 2, 1963, in Atlanta, Georgia, Tammy spent her early years in the South before her family relocated to Brooksville, Florida, a small town about 50 miles north of Tampa. By the mid-1970s, home life had grown chaotic. Her mother, Barbara Jenkins, struggled with prescription drug addiction and severe emotional instability, prone to violent outbursts that made home a volatile place. Tammy's biological father was absent, and Barbara's remarriage brought a stepfather into the house but little stability. Her older half-sister, Pamela Dyson, had a different father and moved out to live with her grandmother when she was about 11, leaving Tammy to navigate the turmoil alone. Pamela would later describe their mother as a real-life mommy dearest, comparing her temper to that of the infamous Hollywood mother portrayed by Joan Crawford, a telling glimpse into the trauma that shaped Tammy's teenage years. Isolated and yearning for freedom, Tammy became known for running away. She craved movement, independence, and adventure, anything that offered an escape from the constant chaos at home. By 15, she and her best friend Laurel Nowell began hitchhiking across Florida, sometimes venturing far beyond. In one remarkable episode in 1978, the two girls, barely old enough to drive, hitched rides all the way across the country to Los Angeles, California. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely unthinkable by today's standards, but for Tammy, it was a taste of freedom. When Laurel panicked and called home, her parents bought plane tickets for both girls to return to Florida. But the trip revealed a lot about Tammy: fearless, restless, and unwilling to be confined. Back home, she took a job waitressing at a truck stop cafe alongside her mother. The job introduced her to the constant rhythm of the open road: truckers, travelers, strangers chasing new horizons. For a teenage girl already drawn to movement, it was a gateway to the wider world. According to later reports, Tammy became an experienced hitchhiker, often catching rides with long-haul truckers. Those who knew her described her as bright and adventurous, but also vulnerable. A girl trying to outrun the pain of home without realizing how dangerous the open road could be. That combination, her restlessness, her exposure to transient travelers, and her longing to leave Florida behind, would eventually set her on the fateful journey north. A journey that ended hundreds of miles away in Caledonia, New York, beneath the gray November sky. Tammy's world, for all its instability, was filled with people who remembered her as light itself. Friends described her as radiant and outgoing, the kind of girl whose laughter filled a room and whose easy charm drew people in. People were just drawn to her, her close friend Laurel Nowell later said, recalling Tammy's smile and contagious energy. But beneath that warmth lived a quiet desperation to escape her mother's volatile home. Her half-sister, Pamela Dyson, would later summarize it simply: "I believe Tammy left to get away from the chaos." Pamela often wondered if she could have saved her, if staying longer might have changed the outcome. But she had been a child herself when she fled the same house years earlier. By early 1979, Tammy, just 15, approaching 16, seemed to reach a breaking point. Records later showed she was placed for a time at the Rainbow Youth Ranch in Young Harris, Georgia, a Christian-based residential program for troubled teens in the foothills of the Appalachians. Whether she arrived through the juvenile system, a church referral, or her family's decision is unclear. What is clear is that the program offered structure, work, and Bible study, an attempt to ground kids drifting off course. Tammy's stay there would become one of the last documented chapters of her life. During that summer, Tammy recorded several cassette tapes she mailed to her boyfriend back in Florida. On them, her voice was full of warmth, talking about her days at the ranch, singing snippets of songs, and describing postcards she admired. In one recording, she spoke about a card that read, "Moon over Miami," describing the ocean and the moonlight shimmering over Florida waters. She called it "completely beautiful." Her voice on that tape, sweet, hopeful, and alive, became one of the most haunting echoes of who she was. By late summer of 1979, Tammy either left the youth ranch or returned briefly to Florida. Whatever her exact movements, by autumn she was back on the road again, this time, it seems, for good. She was 16, restless, and convinced that the life she wanted was somewhere out there, beyond the horizon. Friends believed she may have met someone at the Georgia program or during her travels who offered her a ride north. Given her past hitchhiking experience and her job at a truck stop cafe, it was second nature for her to catch rides with long-haul drivers heading up the interstate. Investigators now believe she likely left Florida in early fall of 1979, possibly hitching rides through the southeast and up the East Coast. Her boyfriend, Kevin, who kept the cassette tapes she'd sent him, confirmed that he last saw her that spring. And by the new school year, she was gone. Tammy turned 16 in November 1979, perhaps thinking it would mark a fresh start, a symbolic leap into adulthood. But fate had other plans. Sometime in early November, Tammy Jo Alexander traveled more than 1,100 miles from Florida to upstate New York. No one knows exactly how she got there, only that she ended up in the small farming town of Caledonia, a place she had no known ties to. On November 9, 1979, witnesses saw her at the Lima Diner, sharing a meal with an older man who paid for both dinners, likely her last meal. Hours later, she was gone. Whether she was heading to Boston, Canada, or simply chasing the next open road, no one can say for sure. Perhaps she was planning to meet someone. Perhaps she'd trusted the wrong person. What is known is that within a day, maybe even hours, of arriving in Caledonia, Tammy's journey ended in that cornfield off US Route 20. Years later, when her identity was finally confirmed, one heartbreaking truth emerged. Tammy's mother, Barbara Jenkins, had passed away in 1998, never knowing what happened to her daughter. She went to her grave believing Tammy had simply run away to start a new life. In a sense, she had, just not the one anyone had imagined. A 16-year-old girl who dreamed of freedom found herself immortalized as a mystery, only to have her story rediscovered decades later by strangers who refused to forget her name. In her mother's obituary, written nearly 2 decades after her disappearance, Tammy Jo Alexander was listed as deceased. There was no proof, just quiet resignation. By that time, almost 20 years had passed without a single call, letter, or trace, and the family could only assume the worst. Whether Barbara Jenkins truly believed her daughter was gone or wrote it as a way to make peace, no one knows. What is certain is that Barbara went to her grave in 1998 never knowing what really happened to Tammy. It was a tragic footnote to an already heartbreaking story, a troubled mother who lost her troubled daughter and never found answers. For Pamela Dyson, Tammy's half-sister, the truth in 2015 shattered the fragile hope she had carried for decades. Until the DNA results came, she had clung to the comforting fantasy that Tammy had found a better life somewhere, far from the chaos of home. Maybe she was married, maybe she had children. Instead, Pamela learned that her sister's story had ended violently in a field almost 40 years earlier. "I'm glad for closure," she said quietly. "But it hurts to know she died that way." Tammy's life became a sobering reflection of a time when too many lost teenagers slipped through society's cracks. In the 1970s, there were no Amber Alerts, no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and no digital databases like NamUs to connect local police departments across states. Thousands of runaways, mostly girls, vanished each year, some escaping abuse, others chasing adventure, and many like Tammy never came home. Her story became both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for progress, underscoring how far the system had to come to protect missing youth. But with her name now known, investigators had a renewed purpose. The question was no longer, who is she, but who killed her? The identification reignited the case as an active homicide investigation, with the FBI joining forces with the Livingston County Sheriff's Office. In early 2015, federal and local authorities launched a national awareness campaign, placing Tammy's photo on billboards across the country, urging anyone with information to come forward. The response was immediate. Old memories stirred, and new tips began to flow in. By late February 2015, investigators announced they had developed a clearer picture of Tammy's final journey, piecing together how she may have traveled from Florida to upstate New York in the fall of 1979. Though they kept many details private, they suggested a more complete understanding of her route, a story that likely spanned hundreds of miles, several states, and multiple chance encounters. One of the most promising leads came from a truck driver in Tennessee who heard Tammy's story on a radio broadcast. He told investigators he remembered a young girl matching her description from around that time, possibly someone he'd seen at a truck stop or even given a ride to. Police called his statement significant. Tennessee sat squarely along the major trucking routes connecting Florida to the Northeast. If Tammy had hitchhiked north on Interstate 75 or Interstate 95, then turned toward New York through the Appalachian Corridor, it was entirely plausible she had crossed paths with him. Truckers, accustomed to long hours and sharp details, often remember faces vividly, especially those that left an impression. And investigators followed up thoroughly, trying to match his account with Tammy's estimated timeline. Then came another thread, one leading back to Young Harris, Georgia, and the now-defunct Rainbow Youth Ranch where Tammy had spent part of that summer. In March 2015, the Sheriff's Department confirmed they had tracked her connection to the ranch, which operated as a faith-based program for court-referred or at-risk youth. Though the founders had passed away and the ministry no longer existed, investigators located a few former staff and residents who remembered the program. Every scrap of recollection mattered now. Tammy's identification had breathed new life into a case long considered unsolvable. The girl once known only as Caledonia Jane Doe now had a face, a history, and a name. And for the first time since 1979, her story was being told not as a mystery, but as a pursuit of justice. The long-forgotten case was alive again. And somewhere out there, perhaps even watching the news of her rediscovery, was the person who had taken her life. The next step in the investigation was as chilling as it was crucial. If Tammy had finally been found, then who had taken her life? Detectives turned their attention to the one place that might still hold answers: the Rainbow Youth Ranch in Georgia, where Tammy had spent that summer before she disappeared. The question was immediate and haunting. Had she met someone there, a fellow resident, volunteer, or visitor, who later traveled north with her? The ranch had once housed dozens of teens, many from troubled homes or on probation, and law enforcement began combing through old rosters and records to see who might have left around the same time Tammy did. The program had a revolving door of young men and women, some with criminal backgrounds, and the possibility that one of them, or perhaps an adult mentor or ex-con volunteer, had offered her a ride seemed all too plausible. By early 2016, investigators announced they had identified 3 male persons of interest who had known Tammy prior to her death. The men's names were never released publicly, but reports suggested they were connected to her past, possibly an old boyfriend from Florida, a friend or acquaintance from the Georgia ministry, or someone she'd met along the highway. Detectives located all 3, decades later, and obtained DNA samples to compare against forensic evidence collected from Tammy's clothing. The results, released that November, ruled all three out. None of their genetic profiles matched the unknown male DNA that had been recovered from the crime scene. Though it might have seemed like another dead end, in reality, it was progress. Every elimination narrowed the field and clarified the timeline. Their interviews also helped investigators rebuild Tammy's final months, uncovering new context about her travels and the people she might have trusted. The case's focal point remained the mystery man seen with Tammy at the Lima Diner the night before her death. The man with curly hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a tan station wagon. Witness Marge Bradford, the waitress who had served them, was the last person known to have seen Tammy alive. After the 2015 identification, investigators re-interviewed her and re-examined every piece of preserved evidence: her red jacket, her plaid shirt, the bullet, even soil samples, using modern forensic technology unavailable in 1979. One advantage of finally knowing Tammy's identity was being able to retrace her route, from Florida to Georgia, possibly Tennessee, and finally to upstate New York. Detectives cross-referenced her movements with similar crimes along major highways in 1979, revisiting cold cases involving hitchhikers or young women shot under similar circumstances. And while no suspect has yet been publicly named, authorities have emphasized that the man from the diner remains the central focus. Composite sketches of his face have been recirculated over the years, and investigators continue to hope that someone, somewhere, recognizes him. A major turning point came with the re-examination of Tammy's clothing, which yielded something no one had expected after decades: a trace of male DNA. Whether from touch, perspiration, or saliva, the sample was strong enough to develop a profile. By 2020, investigators confirmed they were using forensic genealogy, the same groundbreaking technique that led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer. The FBI, working alongside the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, uploaded the DNA into databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, searching for distant relatives who might lead to the killer's family tree. As of now, no close genetic match has been reported, but detectives remain optimistic. Each year, DNA technology improves and the databases grow, and what seems impossible today may be solvable tomorrow. In the meantime, the FBI has offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Investigators believe that after so many years, someone may finally come forward. A witness who stayed silent, a family member burdened by a secret, or perhaps even the killer himself, long believing he'd gotten away with it. For now, Tammy Jo Alexander's story is still being written. Her name was returned to her, her humanity restored, but her killer has yet to be brought to justice. Her case stands as both a triumph of persistence and a haunting reminder of how easily one life can vanish, and how powerful it is when people, across decades and across the internet, refuse to let that life be forgotten. If you have any information about the murder of Tammy Jo Alexander, please contact your local authorities or the Livingston County Sheriff's Office. Justice has waited long enough. And to the detectives, citizens, and web sleuths who gave Tammy her name back, may their persistence one day finish what they began. After nearly 4 decades of silence, Caledonia Jane Doe finally had her name back: Tammy Jo Alexander. A runaway who just wanted freedom, remembered by strangers who refused to let her disappear forever. Her story reminds us that every cold case holds a heartbeat waiting to be heard, and that justice, no matter how late, still matters. If you know something, anything, that could help solve Tammy's murder, contact the Livingston County Sheriff's Office or your local authorities. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in hope after loss. Subscribe for more stories where truth finally finds its way home.